Welcome to the Sage Family Podcast,
where we explore natural homeschooling, gentle parenting,
simple living, and family adventure.
I'm Rachel Rainbolt, the Sage Parenting Coach, coming to you from the Pacific Northwest, where I live wild and free in connection with my 3 wildlings and the Papa Bear in our fixer-upper on the beach. This is episode 69, and today I'm here with Sarah Rosensweet talking about empathy. Sarah is a mother of 3 kids, aged 14, 17, and 20, and a certified peaceful parenting coach, podcaster, and educator in Toronto. Sarah works with families all over the world on peaceful parenting, which is a non-punitive, connection-based approach that uses firm limits with lots of empathy. So join us around the campfire and let's get living the family life of our dreams. Family Village has been one of my favorite things about 2021. The community we've created there, the growth that happens in that space. Well, Elmian said it better than I can. Quote, "I see this village as my adopted family. I am literally the only person I know that tries to be a gentler parent. It can feel so isolating and lonely at times. But knowing that I'm a part of this village makes me feel that I belong and that I'm not alone. This village is my saving grace for real. I feel so much love here. The thoughtful, empathetic, and kind way that you, Yana, and others respond to posts are so special. Being a part of this community helps me to be brave. It helps me to have the courage to advocate for my kid and to swim upstream, knowing that I have you all to support me. This village is a safe haven for me." And so I've decided to invest even more of myself into the village in the coming year, expanding the Bonfire, our monthly live group coaching call, from 60 minutes to 90 minutes, expanding the community forum to include short videos from me on whatever issues you all are wrestling with in the group, and elevating Yana into a leadership role that ensures that even on a day when I'm present with my family in the real world, there are timely and high-quality responses pouring into the village. The introductory price of $9.99 is increasing to $19 to better reflect its value. But here's the thing. If you join now before the price increases on New Year's Day, you get to keep your $9.99 monthly fee for as long as you're a member of the village. And if you opt for a year-long membership, you get 2 months free. It's a great holiday gift idea, a supportive and nurturing experience instead of more stuff that will end up in a landfill. I sincerely hope to connect more deeply with you over in the Sage Family Village, which you can join at sagefamily.com/village. All right. Welcome to the show, Sarah.
I'm so excited to be here, Rachel.
Will you introduce yourself and share a bit about who you are and what you're passionate about?
Sure. My name's Sarah. I live in Toronto, Ontario, Canada, but I'm originally from Vermont. So I have a foot in each country and in my heart. I think my most important thing about me is that I'm a mom to 3 kids who are 14, 17, and 20. And my 20-year-old just moved out in September. So that's a big milestone for all of us.
Ooh.
And, my passion is parenting. And this is a later in life career change for me to become a peaceful parenting coach. It was something that I did when I was like, okay, my last kid is in school. What's my next chapter? And I really, you asked about passion. I looked at what's my passion, and it's always been children and parenting and the family. And so I decided to have that also be my vocation.
Oh, I love this story. I'm definitely in one of those like midlife moments right now where my kids are older and they're needing less. And so I'm trying to give myself like that, like moment of reflection and kind of like recalibrating where all of my energies are going, because I have like this more like energetic bandwidth that's opened up. So I'm trying to make a lot of choices and adjust things and to just pour more into, now that I have more to pour, because my
Yeah.
kids are like, yeah, we're good. Go do something on your own.
Totally. I mean, I'm kind of with you on that. In just the past month or so, I realized that as my kids need less hands-on and less emotional energy too, I've been working too much. And so I'm like, I've got to get some balance back, with like, what else do I want to do? What do I want to do for creativity or me time? And so I think it's like a lifelong process that we're always having to just look at our lives and where we're at and where our energy is and where do we want to put that energy?
Yes. Oh, yes. I cannot agree more. I started training in Krav Maga again, like just a few weeks ago, which is something I did. Oh, like 5 years ago, I stopped when we moved up here to the Pacific Northwest, and I just love it. And it feels so good in my body, and I feel so empowered, and I have so much fun when I do it. So I started doing that again, which feels amazing. And then even within my work, like I'm so passionate and fulfilled by my work, and I so love it. And even within that work, though, there are ways where you can, lean more in certain directions and lean less into others. Like I have this the Sage Family Village, which is like a membership where I do group coaching and I like answer lots of Q&As and stuff. And I'm really like wanting to I'm starting to kind of invest more in that and trying to find ways to pour more into that and help it serve the members even more. But even that, because like it takes more time and energy than some of the other things that I do. So I'm trying to kind of like reallocate where some of my time and energy goes. And it's exciting and a little bit scary and feeling all the feels.
I totally hear you. And I think as entrepreneurs, we do this because we're lifelong learners. And so
Mm.
I started doing training in polyvagal theory, which I'm really excited to bring that to my practice and my community. But we just keep learning, don't we, Rachel?
Yes, yes. Oh my gosh, my therapist friend just put on this training about this therapeutic modality that she thought I would dig, and I totally loved it. Now I'm reading some new books about it. And yes, oh my gosh, like unschooling for the win, embracing that throughout your entire lifespan. And just sometimes in life, because part of the bucket system, we have these like seasonal collaborations with ourselves and or with our kids where we think about how we want to grow and what things we could use some support with and what we're interested in learning more about and all that. And then there are definitely these bigger transitional moments in life where you sort of like call into question even more than you normally would in one of those
Mhm.
seasonal refreshes. And I'm totally in one of those moments. So it's good and inspiring and helpful for me to connect with someone else who's been in one of those moments.
Nice.
And none of this has anything to do really with our topic of empathy today, but this is just what happens when I like already know that I'm really gonna like the person I'm gonna talk to. So I promise we'll get on to topic here.
Sounds good.
Okay, so we are here today to talk about empathy. So my first question for you is, how does an empathetic response impact the trajectory of an intense moment, both for our child and for us?
Okay, can we back up a little bit and give a
Yes.
definition of empathy?
Yes.
So I think it's helpful to just like start with a baseline of what empathy is. And I think that the simplest way to think about what empathy is trying to feel with somebody by putting yourself in their shoes or trying to see things from their perspective, right? So it's really stepping outside of your own mind, which can be hard to do sometimes because honestly, like if somebody cut our sandwich wrong, Rachel, would we care? Like, no, right? We wouldn't care if somebody cut our sandwich wrong, but it might be really important to our 4-year-old. So empathy doesn't mean that you agree. It means that you are trying to see something and feel something from another person's perspective.
Yes. Yes. Helpful. And I think sometimes people don't. I'm glad you define it because sometimes people kind of do misconstrue it in that they might, like empathy doesn't necessarily mean always giving the person what they want because maybe you can't, or that's like would be out of alignment with your values. Maybe your kid wants to throw a rock through a window and like, we still hold boundaries. Like empathy doesn't mean a lack of boundaries. And we're going to talk about boundaries soon. And then the other direction, sometimes people believe that empathy is fully taking on the emotional state of the other person. And that's not really helpful either. Like if I'm feeling an intense moment of grief and I go to my dear friend with that and they're bawling with me and saying it's not fair, like that doesn't necessarily feel helpful either.
Well, it would make you feel not alone for sure. But I think it's, I also think that some people think that empathy is the words that you say. And empathy is more about understanding and feeling. And it's almost, you can empathize with somebody without saying a word. It's less about what you say than about what is in your heart.
Yes. Like and to use that non-judgmental curiosity to imagine what the other person might be feeling and a willingness to sit in that space with them without trying to necessarily fix things or avoid them, and it does take some bravery to be willing to sit in the discomfort of a hard moment with someone else.
Totally. And I think that, a lot of parents are like, well, how am I supposed to empathize with my 4-year-old when they're screaming that I cut the sandwich wrong? And it's, it would be hard. You can't sit there and think, oh, geez, how would I feel if somebody cut my sandwich the wrong way? Because you're never going to get to empathy that way. But you can think, how would I feel if someone that I loved misunderstood what I wanted? Or how would I feel if I was powerless to fix my own food? Right. So we can connect to the feeling that's underneath the situation, the presenting situation, and really empathize with that feeling, because we all know what it feels like to feel misunderstood. We all know what it feels like to feel powerless.
Yes. How frustrating and disempowering does it feel when you have a clear vision in your mind for how you hope something is going to go and then it doesn't turn out that way?
100%.
Yeah. Okay.
So now ask me that question again.
How does an empathetic response impact the trajectory of an intense moment, both for our child and for us?
Yeah. So I always say, a lot of parents will come to me and they'll say, I learned all these, deep breathing and blow out the birthday candles techniques, that the sort of the self-regulation techniques that people use with children sometimes, or, blow on the hot chocolate or whatever. The truth is though, that Rachel, if you were really upset and you were telling your partner how upset you were, and your partner said, okay, just take a few deep breaths, how would that make you feel? Probably not like calming down, right? The truth is that the only thing that makes anyone want to calm down ever is if they feel understood. So empathy is sort of two main purposes, the way I see it, when you have those intense moments. One is that the person, when you are truly empathizing with someone, the person who's upset feels understood. And that brings with it a desire to move past the feeling. It's not like they like, okay, I'm going to let go of this, but it's like the feelings start to dissipate when they feel like they're not alone and that someone understands and gets them. Right. Mm-hmm. And then also I think that when we try to put ourselves in our child's shoes and really see things from their perspective, we can be a lot more patient and compassionate with them. When we think, I can't believe she's screaming about the sandwich being cut wrong. It's really hard to be patient in that moment and to actually deal with the situation. But if we can find some empathy and some compassion, then it actually helps us change our mindset, right? One thing we like to say in peaceful parenting is, they're not giving me a hard time, they're having a hard time. So when we draw on empathy and compassion, that can become more true for us in the moment, and it helps us just deal better in the situation.
Yeah, I think when a child is having an intense moment, that amygdala, that limbic system has taken over, and so they're usually in that fight, flight, freeze state. And when they're in that state, they really can't get to the problem solving. The rational things don't help, and so that empathetic response, what it does, like you said, it helps the two of you to join on to be on the same side, so that they see you as an ally and not a threat. And once you can do that, then that disarms that whole alarm that's sounding, and it allows them to move back into their prefrontal cortex.
Yes. So when you talk about being in fight, flight, or freeze, it's that overwhelm, emergency feeling. And so empathy is actually the soothing Like
Yep.
it's a soothing practice that can help soothe them out of that alarm state.
Yeah. And I think one thing that helped me, and that I know has helped a lot of people, is kind of to shift the mindset around the goal of responding empathetically is not necessarily to solve the problem, but it's to enhance the connection. So sometimes I would even remind myself, like if my child was having an intense moment and a really hard time, to remind myself, like to kind of calibrate my compass toward like enhancing the connection. So like I'm not trying to make the crying stop. I'm not trying to solve the problem, to make this go away, to make them be quiet. My only goal, if you want to use that word, my only intention that I'm setting in moving toward my child in this moment is just to be with them in this hard moment, like just to enhance the connection that we share. And though I'm not necessarily saying any of that out loud to my kid, I know, like I've witnessed that the difference in those two postures is immense in terms of the outcome. So ironically, if I let go of the outcome to like stop whatever behaviors are feeling triggering for me, if I let go of the outcome of trying to control this other human and make the intention just to show up in empathetic connection and be with them in this hard moment, that of course then makes the hard moment like dissipate so much faster, and we can move forward together so much more peacefully.
Totally. And I think that you sort of highlighted one trap that parents fall into sometimes is, maybe they hear us talking about, okay, I'm going to try this the next time my child is having a meltdown or a tough moment. But if they're not truly coming alongside their child and, with a heart and understanding and compassion, and they're just saying empathetic words like, oh, gee, you must be so upset that I cut your sandwich wrong, but they're not actually feeling empathy. It can come across as more of like a tactic, right? And they're like, well, you said that when she was having a hard time, I should empathize, and I said that. And I'm like, but how are you feeling? Well, I was still feeling really angry and upset. And I just wanted her to stop crying. So it's not outcome based. I guess that's my point. Like it's not
Yes.
empathizing with somebody isn't because you're trying to get a specific outcome. And that's what you're talking about with it's coming alongside them with connection.
Yes, yes. It's not about outcome, it's about intention. Like if we can just calibrate before we, as we're walking toward our child in that moment, and it really can just take a moment to like check in with yourself and get clear on the intention. It's just setting that intention of like being an empathetic connection, being with them in this hard moment, as opposed to some sort of control-based, manipulative, outcome-oriented, like you said, goal of stopping the behaviors that
Yeah.
that we're not loving.
And stopping the feelings, right? Like we're so
Yes.
uncomfortable. We're so uncomfortable with big feelings. And I don't know about you, but I think most of us have had this experience where we, tell a partner or a friend, like, oh, it's such a terrible day today. My coworkers are jerks and blah, blah, blah. You're complaining, right? Complaining about your hard day. And have you ever had that experience where someone says, "Oh, come on, it's not that bad. Usually you really like your coworkers and I'm sure your boss was just having a bad day too, right?" And it's not that they're trying to be unempathetic, but they're trying to make us feel better, right? But the
Mhm.
only thing that makes us feel better is if someone were to say, "Oh, I'm so sorry you had such a rough day. Do you want a hug? Is there anything I can do?" That's what makes us feel better. It's when we feel heard and understood. And often when we're not empathetic, but we're just trying to make our kids feel better, it feels to them like we're trying to talk them out of their feelings or their experience or their, reality.
Yes, Bill and Ned of the Self-Driven Child book joined me on a couple of podcast episodes, but recently they joined me for a communication Q&A, and they talk a lot about that writing reflex, where if someone comes to us with something, with the passionate feelings about something like, I'm the worst and I'm so stupid and I'm never going to learn, whatever it is, we have this writing reflex where we try to balance that out by being equally as passionate in the opposite direction. But the children or the other person you're talking to also has this writing reflex. So if you say like, no, you're so smart, you can definitely do, then they have, that equal and opposite reaction to try
Yeah.
to balance things out. So if instead of playing that teeter-totter game, which just continues to pit you guys farther and farther apart, like on opposite sides, you have to start with that empathetic connection, that understanding first, where you can join with the other person and say, like, you're feeling so discouraged while you're trying to do this new thing and you're wondering if you'll ever be able to do it.
Yeah.
Like something, and then boom, like instantly the two of you are on the same side. That writing reflex is like soothed and calmed and turned off, sort of that setting, that switch is set to off. So I mean, that's so helpful. And like empathy is really what helps us to get outside of that writing reflex and get connected and get on the same side.
Yeah, because if somebody feels like we're just trying to talk them out of their feelings, they'll work even harder to try and show us how their feelings actually are right. They'll that arguing
Yes.
back and forth that you're talking about. And I just have like a little sidebar tip if I could share.
Yes, please.
Sometimes parents say, well, my daughter came home and said she has no friends and everybody hates her. And I know that's not true. So like, how am I supposed to empathize with her when this is what she's feeling? And so of course you don't want to say, oh my goodness, I'm so sorry that everyone hates you and you have no friends, right? But you also don't want to say that's not true. You have lots of friends and lots of people like you, because that's the thing we were just talking about that we don't want to do.
Mhm.
So this is a tricky one. How do you empathize without agreeing and make someone feel understood, but not, I agree, everyone hates you. And this is actually something that I learned from my dad. And you can say something like, it must feel awful to feel like you have no friends, right? So you're not
Mhm.
agreeing with it, but it must feel awful to feel that way. And then you can offer a different perspective by saying, that's not how I see it, right? So
Mhm.
you're not disregarding their experience and their perceived reality in the moment. You're actually empathizing with it, but you're also not agreeing. Like, you're right, darling. And, everyone hates you. So I think that's really helpful when our kid has got a lot of negative self-talk, or maybe um, overreacting, and just of course to them it doesn't feel like they're overreacting, but
Yeah, that it feels like that sort
Mhm.
of sentence starter can be helpful, because no matter what they're saying, no matter how not based in reality it feels to our very logical, rational minds that are, when our prefrontal cortex is driving, that seems so obvious. But we can always say, like, sort of reflect back what they're saying with it feels like in front of it. And
Yeah.
that kind of helps to keep that context and give you the room to then ask some follow-up questions once they feel fully understood, to help them challenge and question the meaning that they're assigning to the whatever experience they had. Because really that's what they're doing. Like, they're having a big feeling or a difficult experience, and their brain is trying to make sense of it. They're trying to like quickly write and tell a story around the experience to keep that their narrative, like their idea of who they are and how the world works,
Yeah.
cohesive and intact. And so first, just like you said, like it feels like, and we reflect, it feels, gosh, you're saying it feels like you have no friends, and that must like feel so isolating. I imagine you must feel so alone, or whatever it is. And then once, you do that for a few minutes and you can tell that they're kind of disarmed and they're feeling connected, then you can move into where you start questioning the accuracy of the story that they're telling around that experience. Like, where you
Yeah.
can even just ask questions like, so this person, like, what happened today that, that is leading you to have to believe that, and get more information, then just ask questions about other meaning that could come from the experience they have. Like, oh, your friend said X, Y, and Z. Oh gosh, that I can see how much that hurt you when she said that. Like, so
Hmm.
you're thinking that she said that because she doesn't want to be friends with you anymore. I wonder if you've ever said something like that to someone else, and maybe what were you thinking in that moment, or where did that come from? The specifics don't even matter, just sort of like gently questioning. And we're not saying like, no, she still wants to be your friend, because we don't know, right? We actually don't know. But we're almost even kind of building that empathy, strengthening that empathy muscle in our kid, to just creatively and non-defensively imagine other possible meanings, and maybe their meaning is right, and that, like, that's reality too. But just to give them, to help to tone that muscle, to look at all the different possibilities before you really permanently save something to your narrative.
Yeah. And I love that you said, I wonder is such a wonderful and useful way to encourage a child to think about something in possibly a different way. And it's not that you're telling them this, right?
Yeah. Okay. So as parents, we often fixate on teaching our kids how to be empathetic toward others. Why is it so challenging for us to extend that same empathy to our own children? And I know we talked about this somewhat, but really, and to ourselves, like in hard moments. This is the order that I see parents trying to do it in. First, we want our kids to be empathetic toward others. Then we work really hard to try to be empathetic toward our kids. And then kind of the last sphere is us learning how to be empathetic toward ourselves. Why is that so hard?
A lot of my coaching clients, if I notice that they're having a hard time being empathetic and compassionate towards their children, I really start to dig deeper into how hard they are on themselves, right? So
Mhm.
if you are hard on yourself and don't give yourself compassion and love when you fall down, when you mess up, when things are hard, it's really, really difficult to give it to other people.
Mhm.
And really, starting with, that compassion for ourselves. And what I like to say is, I'm just going to make up an example, but I'm worthy and lovable, even though I just yelled at my kids or yelled in my kid's face or whatever.
Mhm.
And it's really learning, because we didn't learn this as children. And to me, this is the work of peaceful parenting, that we want to teach this to our children. It's that your self-worth and your lovability doesn't depend on what you do, right?
Yes.
Everybody makes mistakes, everybody messes up. And we have to learn that we have to unlearn that our self-worth depends on that, right?
Yes.
So I think that it's hard, it's hard to give ourselves that grace and compassion if we weren't raised with that. If we were taught you're more lovable and more worthy when you are this way, when you don't melt down, when you don't make mistakes, when you do what I
When you
want you
don't
to
have
do.
needs,
Yeah,
when you're
exactly. So, I'm not saying you can't, teach your children about empathy or give them empathy. And if you're not perfect at it yourself, but really that's a great starting place, is how can I be more empathetic with myself and with my shortcomings, and really love myself, even though, or even when. And I think that fear is at the base of preventing empathy always. So
Yep.
a lot of parents will say to me, well, if I'm kind and compassionate with myself when I mess up, then I'm never going to do better. That's
Mm.
so not true. It's important to you, and that's why you're going to do better. You don't need to beat yourself up to do better, right?
Yeah.
So, in fact, I've never ever seen any parent, I mean, maybe you have, but I've never seen any parent be successful in their parenting goals by being hard on themselves.
Yeah, we can't
Um,
shame ourselves into progress.
no, no, and we know that with our kids, right? If we're on this peaceful, positive, gentle, conscious parenting path,
Mhm.
we know that shaming our kids when they mess up isn't what we want to do, but we often will still do that to ourselves, thinking that that's going to make us change. So I think it's that fear, right? The
Mhm.
fear that I've got to be hard on myself so that I will achieve my goals. And I also think it's fear that prevents us from empathizing sometimes. So, your child's melting down, and you really want them to be more resilient, and you really want them to be more, capable of eating a sandwich, even if it's cut in the wrong the wrong shape. And so we tend to just, like, if we're not very practiced at tapping into empathy, we tend to sort of double down on, like, "Oh, it's not that big of a deal," right? Like, come on, sort of that, I call it the suck it up buttercup. And we're afraid that if we empathize, that they'll go even further into the emotion and they'll never learn to,
Mhm.
be flexible about the way that their sandwiches are cut. So I think it's fear. I think it's fear that stops us from being empathetic with our kids. We want them to turn out well, right? We want them to
Yeah.
be like responsible and kind and hardworking and caring and independent and happy adults. And all around us is this narrative of like that sort of the suck it up buttercup. We're afraid to go into that
I th-
place of empathy.
yeah, I think for most parents, the underlying fear is that they're not good enough. And so when their children behave in ways that society deems unacceptable, when they have the audacity to like have a feeling or communicate a preference, that can trigger that fear for us because that society is judging us, judging our worthiness as a parent based on the behavior of our children. So even when we're in our own homes, all of those societal discourses are still running through our mind and weighing on our hearts. And I completely agree with what you said about the order. I think that almost every parent comes to me from having tried to go in that order, where first they wanted their kids to be empathetic toward others. And then they realized, oh, first I have to be empathetic toward them. And then they realized like, oh, first I have to be empathetic toward myself. Like it just sort of keeps kind of moving it more and more inward until you do that, of course, right? All things peaceful, gentle parenting. Like you got to do that inner work on yourself first. And then from you start extending that out more and more and more and more.
Totally. And I love that you brought up that, not feeling good enough, because I think, I know a lot of parents share with me, well, if I had done this better, done this right, then my child wouldn't be having this challenge right now. Right. Like there's so much attachment to our child's behavior and whether we're a quote, good dad or good mom. Right. And even sometimes when our child's just unhappy about something, we think, we unconsciously think, if I were a good parent, my child wouldn't be unhappy right now.
Yes. I think sometimes when we have like when people have a really hard time accessing that empathy for themselves, it can be helpful to imagine, like, what would I say if my best friend were sitting on the sofa beside me right now saying these things that I'm saying? Like, how would I
Yeah.
respond? Or what if, like, if you have a daughter, like, what would I say to my grown daughter if she came to me with these thoughts and feelings? Like, how would I respond? It's because it's often, particularly as women, like we are often raised and sort of trained to be far more empathetic toward others than we are toward ourselves, be harder on ourselves. So it's much easier for us to access that empathy if we imagine that a dear beloved friend, or a grown child, or even sometimes our inner child. Sometimes I'll have like a client bring a photo of themselves at the same age their child is. And sometimes that can help to like unlock a lot of empathy toward our own experiences, towards our own needs, is to kind of speak to an earlier version of yourself.
I love that. I have a blog post about self-compassion, and I talk about being your inner best friend instead of your inner mean girl, right? Because oftentimes it is that inner critic voice is, I can't believe you did that again. What's wrong with you? And instead,
Yeah.
like, oh, that must have been such a hard day today. What would you say to your best friend if they called you up and told you about the horrible day they had? They would say, tomorrow's a new day. You're a great mom. Everybody has bad days sometimes, right? But it's so hard for us to say those things to ourselves.
Yes. Yeah. And if you're struggling with it too, like it can be helpful to, like, oftentimes it's kind of the same, we're like lashing ourselves with the same thoughts or like reprimands over and over again. So if you can kind of journal what those are, just spend one whole day. Like every time you're feeling triggered, every time you're feeling shame, every time you're feeling guilt, every time you're feeling, what any of those kinds of feelings, just journal the thoughts you have, like right as that cascade of emotion begins. And then in a time where you're perfectly calm and not triggered, you can journal some responses to those. Like, again, like things you would say if your dear friend were saying any of those things. And then set the intention that just once, like once each day over the next week, when you have one of these thoughts, you're going to speak this response. Like you've sort of like written them out, you've practiced them, and then start off trying just once each day when you have that thought to replace it with this other one, or to respond to it in this really empathetic way, and then once you're comfortable doing it once a day, then try twice a day. So kind of like lowering the bar for success, like as much as I wish I could say like, oh yeah, you just decide and then you're totally empathetic and kind and gentle with yourself. It takes practice, right? This whole peaceful parenting thing is about a way of being in relationship with yourself and with others and with the world. It's not so much restricted to the parenting relationship, and it's a practice, and it takes practice. So just start with one time and then give yourself permission to be wholly imperfect and to surrender to your earlier programming the rest of the day, and try it in just one moment, and then maybe 2 moments, and then maybe 3 moments, and you kind of work up from there, and you build up that muscle, and it gets easier and it feels more natural the more you do it.
Yeah. And I like that, I mentioned this phrase before, but, maybe at this time you say, even though I yelled at my kids 3 times today, I'm still worthy and lovable.
Yes, yes, yes. Okay, so let's talk about boundaries. How can empathy serve us and our child when we need to hold a firm boundary?
So for example, if they need to do something that they don't want to do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I think it's that the question of, well, can I just zoom out a little bit
Yeah.
first? I think it's really important to remember that this is part of a bigger picture. And if our child experiences us as generally being pretty, willing to find win-win solutions, not being power tripping or arbitrary or controlling, in all of, all the other moments of the day, we always ask ourselves, is this limit necessary and is it developmentally appropriate? And try to say yes as much as possible. When we
Mm-hmm.
do get to that moment where I'm really sorry, this is just the way it is, right? This is just,
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to think of an example. We just really we do need to brush your teeth or whatever it
Mm-hmm.
is. I know how much you don't want to, and just that feeling heard and understood can really help our child feel more cooperative. They feel like we're on the same side and on the same team, even though they don't want to do what we're asking them to do.
Yeah. Yeah. And like I mentioned earlier, I think some people have this idea that like if you're being empathetic, it means that you don't hold boundaries. And that's not true. If your child's diabetic and they have to, get their insulin shots and, like there are lots of things in this world that we just have to do on this gentle parenting path. If someone's coming to me from the mainstream parenting path, a lot of our work initially is usually to let go of like 80% of the boundaries that are completely arbitrary
Yeah.
and are not important and are not essential and are not meaningful. And then we kind of use our relational collateral to help them through that 20% of things that really are important. That, like, I talk a lot about our like 3 agreements, and that is like respect yourself, respect others, respect the environment. So like I mentioned earlier, if your kid's about to throw a rock through a window, like I'm going to hold the boundary around that,
Hmm.
and I'm not going to let them throw a rock through a window. But we can enforce boundaries with empathy. Like when we start with empathy and we can move through those boundaries calmly and clearly and firmly and, swiftly and all of that. But starting with that empathy, that again, it like connects you as allies, which helps you move through those boundaries more, a lot more easily.
Yeah. And again, it's not a tactic to get cooperation. It's
Mhm.
it's a way of making your child feel like they matter and you understand them even as you can't honor what they would prefer.
Yeah. Yeah. And when you are consistent with those boundaries, it really does enhance the trust. Because children trust that if you're saying that something has to happen or cannot happen, like you have a really good reason for it. And that trust develops with a lot of that empathy building. Like I see what I really see what you want here. And this is why it can't happen in this way. And to help them move through it. But when you're like letting go of all the arbitrary boundaries and then just holding those really important boundaries with consistency, but always having that foundation of empathy, that even in those moments when you hold those boundaries, you're still enhancing the connection. Like my child in that moment may not be happy that I'm not letting them throw the rock through the window, but really in the broader scheme of things, like when they're outside of that moment of anger or curiosity or whatever the motivation was, they're grateful. Like they even if they don't communicate it in their words, you can see it in the level of trust they have in you, that they feel safe in the container that you create. Like they know that you're not going to let them do something that they're going to regret later.
Yeah, I sort of see it. Often talk about it as like money in the bank. Like when your
Mm-hmm.
child experiences you as trustworthy, and not, arbitrary, controlling, power tripping, you can make a withdrawal out of that bank account when you say this something really needs to happen or something really can't happen because they have experienced you as having their best interests at heart.
Yes, absolutely. Um, okay, so let's talk about mindset. What are some tools that can help us come from a place of empathy in our parenting and in the rest of our relationships? Any tools you have to share with us?
Yeah, I have my favorite mindset hack slash way of living is to recognize that people are doing the best they can.
Hmm.
And that helps me with, my kids if they're being difficult, my partner, the, checkout person at the grocery store, like whatever it is. And I really believe that people are doing the best they can. And I know that to be true because our survival as humans depends on a close connection with the other people in our lives, right? Like we if we don't want to get left on a rock when the tigers are coming, somebody has to be in connection with us and care about us, and we're hardwired to seek that connection for our survival. So if someone's acting out of connection, and they're being difficult or challenging, it's because there's something else going on. So that they're doing the best they can is such a good reminder for me, and I know for the parents in my community that my kid might be being provocative right now, or my partner's being cranky. It's not because they're giving me a hard time, right? They're just having a hard time. So that to me is the biggest mindset shift to get into an empathetic perspective and to be able to access that empathy. It takes us out of the victim role. It helps us see the bigger picture of like, what else is going on here with this person that's making them act in this challenging way, and that they may be low on resources today or in general.
Yeah. And it makes our experience of our days and our lives so much better. I mean, if we're in the car and someone, cuts us off and speeds in front of us or slams on the horn because they think we're not turning soon enough or whatever it is, if we can respond to that by imagining how they might be feeling, but with some empathy, that changes our experience of that interaction. And that in and of itself is a huge benefit. Like if we're talking about being in the car, I mean, the other person in the car probably won't even ever know, that we were choosing to be in that space of empathy, but our nervous system knows it, like, and our body knows it. And so it even just improves our experience of our days and our lives when we can say, oh gosh, I can only imagine how hard their life must, or how hard it must be to be them in this moment, that like somebody, waiting to turn right on red is taking their time with it. Like the pressure that they must be feeling, the stress they must be under. Like I can, I feel so badly that that's the state they're in today. And I really hope that they're, able to gain some peace or whatever it is. But when you can take that hold that empathetic posture, even for a stranger who'll never know you're holding it, it really does make your life better, as opposed to imagining they're out to get me and they hate me. And am I not good enough? And am I not fast enough or what? Like just choosing to move into that space of empathy can radically change your experience of life as you move through the world.
Well, I think you nailed it, because it's just about when we recognize that somebody's doing the best they can, we're not taking it personally.
Yes.
And if we're not taking it personally, then we don't get offended, or we don't get hurt, or we don't get, riled up in some way or another. I don't know, have you seen the movie The Wisdom of Trauma, the Gabor Mate movie?
No, they reached out for me to be affiliate of it, and then I have not yet watched it. So
it's great. Well, there's just this one scene where he's talking to Tim Ferriss, the whatever he is, I don't know, the guy, the famous guy. And he does this exercise with him where he says, okay, picture the last time you got really upset about something. And forgive me if I get details wrong, but I think you'll be able to get the gist. So Tim Ferriss is like, okay, well, I went out of town and these guys were supposed to come over and paint my house and they didn't come. And I was really angry. And Gabor Mate says, well, why were you angry? And he said, well, I just felt completely like they didn't care about the commitment. They disrespected me. They didn't care about the commitment that they made to me. And, he was taking it really personally. And Gabor Mate said, what if you could have thought, oh, maybe the guy's mother died and he couldn't make it, or maybe he has ADHD and he has a hard time meeting his commitments. Like the most likely explanation is that it had nothing to do with you.
Yes.
Right? So it's a slight tangent, but I think it's that we get angry when we take something personally and we think it has to do with us. And when we can instead recognize that the person's doing the best they can, then it takes our reactivity out of it.
Yes. I think the first time I heard that maybe was in the book, The Four Agreements. I think that's one of them, right? Correct me if I'm wrong, audience. I think that's one of those, the four agreements of like not taking things personally. I think that was the first time where I ever heard that. And when I started trying to play with that and try that out, I realized like, oh, the alternative then is empathy. Like that's what fills in that space. Like if I'm not ascribing all sorts of negative intentions and making all sorts of meanings about myself, about how their behavior is some sort of judgment on myself. What if I'm not doing any of that? Like, what fills in the space is empathy. It's imagining, it's letting them own their stuff, which is really important in parenting too. Like letting your kids own their feelings, not trying to take over them or take them away or shut them down, right? Same thing in life. Like if I can let them own their stuff, then what naturally springs from that is empathy.
I love that.
Okay. Now that your own children are a little older, can you share any stories that for you highlight the power of raising children with empathy? How do they embody that family value as young adults?
So you did share this question with me earlier, so I have been thinking about it. And actually there are two little stories that I would love to share. And it's actually not from when my middle son, who's now 17, was a little bit younger. And not as a young adult, but if I could share these two stories about him, because he is such an empathetic person. And I think that my youngest and my oldest are both more sort of naturally sensitive and empathetic. And my middle, I think if he had been parented a different way, just with his personality and temperament, he might not necessarily have developed these skills. But he, when he was in grade 6, or sixth grade, as you say there, another mother came up to me, and her child was also in the same grade, and her child was a kid who had some challenges, and they weren't really friends, her son and my son. And she said, "I have to tell you what my son said about your son." And I kind of was like, okay. I wasn't sure what was going to come out. And she said that her son said, "Asa is the kindest boy in grade 6, even though he's good at sports." And I just thought that was amazing, that for a 12-year-old to get that compliment. I think good at sports was code for popular kid, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And for a 12-year-old to have that be the thing that another child sees as a defining characteristic, that he's kind, I just thought that was amazing. So that was a really proud moment for me that I still cherish. And then another time, I think actually he was in high school, maybe grade 9 when this happened. He came home and he said, "Mom, I've just been feeling terrible about something all day." And I said, "What is it?" He said, "Well, when I was on the subway this morning, I saw this person with white hair, and I was looking at them and I was really confused because they looked really young, and I couldn't understand why they had white hair and they were young. And so I was staring at them. And then they turned and looked at me, and I realized that they were albino. And I felt so bad for staring, and it's just been bothering me all day." And I just thought, oh my gosh, like what a lovely, that he was so empathetic in that moment to thinking about this person who probably gets stared at a lot because they look unusual, and that he just felt really bad about it. So, I said, I think that's probably natural. And if it ever happens again, just smile when you see the person looking back at you. But I don't know, those are just two little stories of ordinary moments in life that to me brought home the power of raising children this way, and that the humans that they turn into.
Those were such lovely stories. But I have to start with a disclaimer that I try not to hold my children up as proof of concept, as that is a pressure that I would not want to put on them. That just feels like it's not theirs to carry. I try to unhook from the outcome of who my children are, who they choose to be, and how they choose to live as a judgment on the value of how I chose to show up for them. I show up with empathy in the present because it's right and good, and I see how it nourishes their souls right here today. Now, do I believe that treating people in this way nurtures high quality human beings and makes the world a better place? Yes, yes, I do. Does the evidence and research support this belief? Yes, yes, it does. But I also respect my children's autonomy. They don't need to grow up to be me to preserve my ego or my sense of peace and purpose. Who I'm thinking of especially as I add this disclaimer are neurodiverse families. Sometimes, often for these families, what you see on the outside in terms of behavior is not necessarily reflective of what is being poured in. They are not necessarily poster children for some idealized outcome of gentle parenting, but that work, that pouring in, is still worthwhile. That said, I totally get how people feel inspired when they are touched by connections with my children in real life. And it is fueling for me to recognize these moments. So I'll share a story about Bay, who was a junior instructor at sailing camp over the summer. Each session, there would be kids in the camp who didn't necessarily want to sail or who had a lot of fear around being on the water. The instructors, mostly teenagers, struggled to work with these kids. One day when I came to pick him up, the director pulled me aside and expressed how grateful she was for Bay because he is so gifted at helping these kids who are having a hard time. If a child was crying, they would be sent off in a boat with my son, and he was able to hold that empathetic space that they needed to work through their fears. When they asked what he did to make them stop crying and sail the boat, he said that he didn't try to make them stop crying or sail the boat. He just sat with them and listened to their feelings and their fears while he sailed the boat. And once they trusted him, they started to sail.
I love that. That's a great story.
Okay, I asked the Sage Family Village what questions they had about empathy, and Elmian asks, what is the best way to support a child having a meltdown in public in front of members of the extended family? I always try to validate feelings, and my kiddo knows that all emotions are welcome as I try to hold space for all her feelings. I honestly do not care about what other people think, but people sometimes get judgy toward my kiddo in the midst of a meltdown, and that I don't like. For example, come on now, that's nothing to cry about.
So, I think that to go back to what we were just talking about a few minutes ago with everybody's doing the best they can, and that relative is doing the best they can and trying to, make your child feel better, maybe assuage their own discomfort with feelings, and really just going with what they were taught, right? Like that's how they were raised. That's all, that's nothing to cry about. Big kids don't cry or whatever it is. So, starting with that moment of self-regulation and reminding yourself that this person's doing the best they can. And then I think you could say something like, oh, thank you so much for your concern. I've got this. Right. So, you're not shutting down the person. It's probably not the time to talk about why it's better to welcome feelings than shut them down, right? In the midst of a meltdown. And also maybe just give yourself a little bit of space by, if you can, taking your child to another spot. So you don't have to, I know this person said they don't care what other people think, but it's still a little disarming to be parenting in front of an audience. So if you can, try and get yourself a little bit of privacy, and just, use your empathy on that person who is maybe not seeing things the same way that you are. And who knows, you may have just taught them something, right?
Yeah. Yes, I love your advice of starting with that piece of empathy. When I hear people say things like that, come on, now that's nothing to cry about. I was going to say immediate reaction, but really that was like, it's like years of practicing is one of empathy. And that I think like, how sad for you that that you weren't allowed to feel, hard feelings or
Yeah.
some sort of empathy like that. Like, again, not taking it personally, like this is about them. Like they weren't allowed to feel uncomfortable feelings or had negative feelings, when they were growing up, and they're still carrying that with them today. I imagine through empathy like that, this is essentially what they say to themselves. Like if they feel like they're about to cry, like, come on now, that's nothing to cry about. They
Right.
don't allow themselves to feel that, or certainly to express it to anyone else. So again, like starting with that empathy, I completely agree, is a great place to start. In the moment, I like to have, depending on the person and depending on the family and really the culture, like I know that this person's from South Africa, so there would be cultural things that would be different to how I would respond. And also depending on safety. So, if you are dependent on these extended family members for survival, like your response is going to be different, than someone like me who is not. So taking all of those factors into consideration, I like to help people develop like sort of a one-liner that you say every time. Like I think that you, Sarah, and what you just said, something about like, oh, I've got it, or something like that. it can be something really simple, but kind of tailoring that one-liner that you say every time something like this happens, in a calm moment, like when you're not actually in the deep end of this hard interaction, but planning out something like that you can say every time. And then if it's something that happens over and over again, I would have a conversation with them preemptively, like proactively, like outside, like not when your kid's having a hard moment, maybe when they call you to say, hey, Aunt Susan's having her birthday party, we'll see you on Tuesday at 4. Maybe that's when like you have the conversation where you just put some boundaries in place, like, hey, I just wanted to let you know that if so-and-so is having a hard time and starts to cry, I've totally got it handled, and I'll go over as soon as she gets upset, and I'll take care of it. So but also keep in mind that when they are coming over and saying things like that, that's actually them trying to be supportive and trying to be helpful. So I might give them something that they can do that is helpful. So I might say, like, if you want to be helpful, you're welcome to bring us a bottle of water, because sometimes when she's upset, she gets really thirsty. That'd be helpful, but you don't have to. Just if you feel like you want to be helpful, that'd be received as helpful. So setting a boundary of like, when you say this, that's not helpful, but here's something that you can do that is, and then letting them know that you'll handle it and you'll take care of it in the moment.
My favorite one-liner for unsolicited advice is, "Thank you. I'll take that into consideration."
I'm such a rebel. Like I that works really well, and I agree that is the right thing to say for so many people and in so many situations. And for me, I feel, I don't know, maybe it's like extra confrontational. Like, I'm not going to take like, if I'm not going to take it into consideration, I'm like radically honest to a fault. Like,
you could say that out loud in your mind. You've already taken it into consideration and dismissed it, but you just don't have to say that I've taken into consideration and I'm dismissing it part.
Yes. And in that proactive conversation, I often recommend people to say something like, I've considered everything you've had to say on this subject. Like you said, because honestly, you have, even if it's just for a moment. Like, I've thought about everything that you said on this, and I've done my own research and gotten to know this child really well. And we're choosing to respond in this different way. So you don't have to agree with it, but you do have to respect it, and just know that I'll take care of her if she gets upset. So no, I love that. That's totally helpful. All right, let's move into our deep dive. The show notes can be found at sagefamily.com/podcast69, where you can also subscribe and get future show notes sent right to your inbox. So Sarah, what are your favorite resources for people to dive deeper into this topic? And you can include some of that good stuff that I know you have out there for families that I'll link to in the show notes.
Awesome. Well, when we were talking about those difficult moments and finding a place of empathy, it's really hard to do that if you're dysregulated. So in peaceful parenting, we always talk about first always self-regulation, right? Like we can't use any of these awesome tools and strategies that we've been talking about today if we're dysregulated, right? If we're angry, frustrated, not calm ourselves. So I have a low-cost course called How to Stop Yelling at Your Kids. It's available on my website, sarahrosensweet.com/yelling. And that's just a really great sort of intro resource to this work, because we do always need to start with ourselves. We've touched on that a couple of times today. And, if we didn't grow up with our feelings being welcomed and empathized with, some of us might have some challenges with yelling, or just really, taking our big feelings out on our kids. So that's one resource I have for parents. And then I also just have a fun one. I have a quiz on my website to discover your parenting superpower, because I think so much of the time we spend, when we're talking about parenting, we spend talking about the things that we need to improve on or that we want to improve on. And sometimes it's just fun to think, like, what am I already good at? Like, how can I focus on that and celebrate that? And that's also on my website.
Awesome. I will link to both of those. I'll link to the Gabor Mate video. It's the 4 Agreements book I mentioned. When I listen through any of those good recommendations that we talked about, I'll be sure to include in the show notes. In addition,
can I also, sorry, I forgot one important thing. I also have a podcast, which I always forget to tell people. So that you can also find that on my website. I do a combination of guest expert interviews, and Rachel's going to be on in the new year. And I also do coaching calls with parents just like you, and occasional solo episode where I dive deeper into a topic.
I always forget to mention my podcast when I'm on podcasts, which is
Yeah.
so ridiculous.
Totally.
And then I'm so glad you mentioned it, because that's literally how I found you, was through your podcast. It's one of the podcasts that I enjoy listening to. Often when I listen to like parenting podcasts, for every like 10 I try, like maybe I'll like one. I have high standards and a very specific value set around parenting. So your podcast was one of those very few that I listened to, and I'm like waiting for you to say the thing that like makes me disagree with you, and it just didn't come, so I just kept listening, and I found it was really valuable and I really enjoyed it. And that's when I sent it to my assistant client friend, Yana, and said, hey, listen to this podcast. Isn't she lovely? Like, we should share a conversation with her. So
Nice.
Definitely everyone should listen to your podcast. And thank you so much for coming on, Sarah. And I sincerely look forward to getting to talk again, so that we'll just use the excuse of being on your podcast next time. But I'm looking forward to just getting to talk with you some more.
Yay. Thank you so much, Rachel.